day after, well, our worst GDP results. The corona hit first quarter numbers are out. Joining me is the Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian. Thank you, sir, very much for being on the show. Well, difficult times. Did you expect the numbers to be so bad?
Good evening, Sonia. Yes, this was along expected lines because we have to remember that this is an exogenous shock that COVID has induced globally. Just to give you one fact, if you look at the fraction of countries where the GDP per capita is going to shrink, that fraction is going to be the highest this year for the first time in 150 years. The last time this happened was in 1870. In other words, we are living through an event that is once in a 1.5 century kind of event. So it's an exogenous shock, clearly. During this quarter, April to June, the entire globe was in lockdown, and India had a very intense lockdown as well through the entire quarter, which had placed significant restrictions on economic activity. And that is why the print that we've gotten is what it is. Just to give you one parallel, let's take the United Kingdom, which is of a very similar size in terms of the GDP. It's similar to India. They had a shrinkage of about 22%. India had a more intensive lockdown, and therefore this print is not unexpected. Right. That said, Sonia, what is important to keep in mind is also that there is a recovery that is clearly on. If you look at some of the key indicators, if you look at e-way bills, in the month of August, about 26 days for which we have the data, it is 99.8% of what it was, in the same period last year. So almost the same. If you look at power consumption, only about 1.9% down. Cement, steel. If you look at railway freight, which was 95% level, of what it was last year in July, and is 6% higher now in August. And if you take core sector output, which had declined by 38% in the month of April, has since basically, improved with 22%, 13%, and now 9.6% in July. So clearly a recovery, a sharp fall, and then a recovery. So if you look at all these indicators, clearly the recovery is on, and therefore the worst is behind us.
Right. So, Dr. Subramanian, you pointed out what you say are green shoots of the economy. But let me just get various reactions, because in fact, this term you use, V-shaped recovery, it's of course a well-known economic theory as well. But you have been criticized by many for this term, because making the point that you have been now saying V-shaped recovery from the time this slowdown, or actually this we actually went into this economic slide or crash. In fact, Ratan Roy, the former PM's Economic Advisory Council, the former counsel of the current PM, the current government, says, I don't know the alphabets he's talking about, I know economics. The former Finance Minister P. Chidambaram has said, you've been talking about a V-shaped recovery since 2019, and of course, he's criticized you and saying that, you haven't even met the Prime Minister recently. This is just your theories, which have no basis on the ground. How would you respond to the various critics? I mean, this V-shaped recovery is becoming almost a spoof online now.
Sonia, as I was already, pointing out, I am speaking based on the data that I'm seeing, and I actually listed those out. What is a V-shaped recovery? A V-shaped is basically when there is a fall, after which the indicators start going up. It's possible that the slope actually may not be exactly the same as that of the fall, because the fall is a drastic one. But clearly, the indicators that I gave you, whether it's the e-way bills, whether it's actually the freight, cement or steel consumption, or power consumption, or the core sector output, clearly after the significant decline, there is recovery. So, I'm speaking based on data. I'm not here to give an opinion or even to respond to opinion.
In fact, but interesting, you made the comparison with the United Kingdom. Now, we know India's GDP fall or contraction has been the worst amongst major economies, contrasting, of course, China is the only economy which has shown positive growth. All the other economies have been hit very badly, but India has been hit the worst. And the UK comparison may be slightly fallacious because the fact is that our base, especially of people below the poverty line, is so much larger. So the impact of a GDP slowdown is a direct impact on jobs. It has a human impact which cannot be really compared to, say, a developed country like the UK. How are you actually calculating that?
See, the reason I used United Kingdom is to actually look at the macroeconomic, effect of the lockdown. As we all know, and if you go and check the data for the intensity of the lockdown that the Oxford University tracks across countries, if you go and look at those indicators as well, it is very clear that India had an intense lockdown, which was greater than that in other countries, including the United Kingdom. Because the United Kingdom has a GDP that is similar to ours, I've used that comparison to make the point that across the globe there was a lockdown during the April to June quarter, and India also had an intense lockdown. So that therefore the restrictions that were placed on economic activity were bound to have an impact on the economic indicators, because the economic indicators do not appear in a vacuum. They are actually driven by economic activity. When you have restrictions, there will basically be impact. So that's what I'm saying. That's why I'm comparing to the United Kingdom.
No, but so when you look at the impact in a country like India, a developing country, a high level of unemployment, and the worries, of course, about what this GDP contraction will now mean in the months to come, the Prime Minister himself said it's about balancing lives and livelihood. In hindsight, when we look at the intense nature of our lockdown and also look at the fact that today we are the country with the highest number globally of rising cases, that currently in deaths we are number 3 in the world, do you think we should perhaps have had a less intense lockdown which would not have crippled the economy so badly?
So, Sonia, first, this is something that health experts are the best to answer. I will definitely give my opinion based on the research that I have read, research by epidemiologists. When you look at a country like India with a population that is almost 1.4 billion, and a pandemic, because of the network effects that it has, is that the impact can potentially be much greater in a country with a larger population, especially a country that has the kind of population density that India has. And these are reasonable measures that even epidemiologists use. There are studies out there which also actually look at the counterfactual, which is, but for the lockdown, what would the cases have been? Hindsight, of course, is 2020, but decisions have to be made with foresight, not hindsight. And when you take that into account, these realities, and the fact that just a state like Gujarat has almost the same population as a country like Germany, when you compare on a per capita basis, you can see that clearly the lockdown has had its benefits. But that is something that I'm actually saying from my reading of the research. I think health experts are better equipped to say on the lockdown. My point here is that given the intensity of the lockdown and the economic restrictions that there were, the GDP contraction is not unexpected. That said, clearly the indicators point out that the worst is over.
In fact, I do agree with you, because initial projections at some point had made the point that there could be millions of deaths. At the moment, India is at 64,000. Our fertility rate is still lower than most other countries with a similar number of cases. So that's some point of a silver lining. Of course, it's not a lining for those people who've actually had loved ones die. But just to ask, then we've come to a situation where I think economically we just can't afford to lock down anymore. So we're seeing unlock 4, we're seeing India opening up, but then that is coinciding with an unprecedented rise in cases as well. So are we now perhaps going the other end of the spectrum, that we were too tough in the beginning and now being opening up too rapidly at a time when cases are rising?
Sonia, again, focusing on the economic, aspects, what is, and this is being seen in if you look at the e-way bills data, despite there being local lockdowns, and as you would appreciate, local lockdowns affect the interstate trade. So e-way bills are showing up at almost the same level as last year. And that is despite some of these local lockdowns that are happening because of the pandemic. But the unlock phase has clearly shown the data, and we in the ministry here track about 60 indicators, high frequency indicators on a fortnightly basis. And based on those indicators, it clearly seems to suggest that the unlock phase has enabled the recovery. Yes, some of the local lockdowns will be required, given the given the cases in particular geographical areas. Those will have some local impacts which may affect interstate trade, but overall at the macroeconomic level, it seems like the unlock has helped in the recovery.
Do you feel that now, and an SPI report is out which predicts the GDP could be, the contraction for the year ahead could be about 10%. Do you see that India now officially being in a recession? Do you think that India has gone into a recession at this point? What's your forecast?
What is important, Sonia, at this point is to focus on the fact that clearly, there is a recovery that is going on. In a period of extreme uncertainty like the one that, we are witnessing, it's very hard to put down numbers. In times like, of uncertain times, as Deng Xiaoping used to say, you actually cross the river by feeling the stones. And so you have to actually, take it step by step. It's very difficult at this point in time to predict what the full year number would be. But going forward, there is no doubt that the numbers will be better.
So, well, glad to hear you're optimistic on that. Of course, at the moment also, there's a big debate on GST and whether the government has the money to actually fulfill some of its obligations, whether there should be more borrowing. The RBI's economic report is also out. There's been some controversy of the words used, act of God. Some saying act of, the finance minister said that this is an act of God what's happened, so we can't actually pay out the GST. The opposition saying it's more about praying to God. And again, many people have written into us after we put out that you were actually coming on the show. And one Twitter user has written in saying that the Indian GDP before March 2020 has actually fallen from Q2 2018, when it was about 7.1%, to Q4 2019-20 to 3.1%. So don't blame God for what the government's inaction is.
So from an economic perspective, Sonia, this is a time where, as economists would recommend, it's overall spending that is important. I wouldn't get into the distinction between whether it should be center versus state spending. What is really critical at this point in time, given that consumption accounts for about 60% of GDP, and that is in the private sector. Similarly, investment accounts for 25% of GDP, and the impact of the pandemic on consumption and investment has to basically be filled up by the government spending. So that is something which is important to keep in mind. Another key aspect in the Indian context, many of us forget, but during the Asian financial crisis, for 3 years, the Indian economy had recorded GDP growth rates of 3.8% in 2000, 4.8% in 2001, and 3.8% in 2002. It was the fiscal spend at that time, especially the infrastructure that was built, the Golden Quadrilateral, which of course increased the debt to GDP ratio to its peak, close to 85, 86%, but brought growth back. And the growth that we had starting from 2003 onwards, on average 8% till the global financial crisis, came from the fiscal spend. So it's not, India has been there in this period. There are very good positive lessons to learn from that Asian financial crisis experience and avoid what happened during the global financial crisis, when again the fiscal spend was done, but the quality of expenditure was poor. As a result, we basically had the taper tantrum in 2013. So to avoid what we actually did, following the global financial crisis, but to implement what we did during the Asian financial crisis. But
the opposition would argue again on this point, because in fact, ex-Congress President Rahul Gandhi yesterday released a video saying we keep talking about the corona impact, but it's actually what happened with decisions like demonetization that we saw the GDP fall after that, and they had no time to recover, and then we went into an event which, of course, as you pointed out, is unprecedented, unforeseen. So it actually was the hangover of bad economic decisions by the government, not an act of God, which has led to our GDP contracting so much.
Sonia, as an economist, I will stick to economics, and I would mention and just point out to the detailed examination that we had done in the economic survey this year. There was a section that went into why has there been a decline. We clearly showed, using very careful empirical analysis, that the financial sector problems, which you have to remember because, bank loans are typically 5 to 6 years of maturity. So the impacts are actually felt with a considerable lag. It was basically the financial sector problems that impacted investment, which in turn impacted, GDP growth and thereby consumption. And now we basically, the difference in consumption has affected investment. This is, the period before the COVID crisis. But right now we are basically facing something that is a clearly exogenous event, and which we, nobody can deny. As I said, something that actually the previous pandemic of this nature was 100 years back. The kind of decline in GDP per capita across countries was 150 years back. So I think nobody can deny the fact that the current economic impact is primarily due to an exogenous shock.
The RBI in its recent economic report has pointed out that the big focus now has to be government spending. Now, we saw a stimulus package which the Prime Minister announced of 20 lakh crores. Now, there's been some debate on what the actual impact has been. Is there going to be a second stimulus package? How does the government plan to ramp up expenditure at a time when the revenues are falling so drastically?
So, during such extraordinary times, we have to actually implement extraordinary measures. And in this trade-off between growth and, debt sustainability of fiscal deficits, for a country like India with the, potential growth being close to 7%, we must be concentrating on growth. We must be leaning on growth, especially in times like this. As I already pointed out, we had an episode like this, in the late 90s, early 2000s, when, because of the Asian financial crisis, there was a decline in growth. The fisc was also, affected because of the decline in the growth. But government stepped up its spending, and that is what really enabled growth to come back. And that same template is something that we have to implement now as well.
Finally, I said, you of course had talked about, ethical wealth creation in your earlier economic surveys. You coined the term Thalinomics. When you look at Thalinomics, and again, there's much debate about that term, the big focus for many people is how, when you look at a time of rising unemployment, decline in employment, when you look at the term of layoffs, whether it's across white-collar jobs, whether in the informal sector, is not even calculated in this GDP. So the impact in the informal sector may be much, much more. How do you look at Thalinomics at a time like this? How do we actually address the big issue of jobs? Because if you look at the GDP, maximum impact have been in job creating sectors, whether it's construction, whether it's services, whether it's manufacturing and mining. Those are the biggest hit sectors, except for agriculture, which doesn't have so many employment opportunities.
So Sonia, the idea of Thalinomics was primarily to try and enable a common person to be able to understand inflation using something as common as a plate of food that all of us encounter every day. Using that, I would say that the primary impact of COVID is deflationary. And so, it is something which affects demand, especially of discretionary items, which itself happens because of the uncertainty, and all of us, thereby, resorting to the savings motive, the precautionary motive to save. So that affects discretionary items. So overall, the impact, from an inflationary perspective is that demand basically goes down. There has been some increase in the consumer price inflation, even though wholesale price inflation has been negative. That's because of some of the supply side disruptions from the wholesale to the retail side. So that is something which I actually foresee as as temporary may actually not be in the same place, may change depending on the local lockdowns. So overall, the supply side frictions, I anticipate those to actually ameliorate as we go forward. And because of the demand side impact, the thali price should actually, not go up, possibly go down, but not go up. That's the way I anticipate it. Now, to your first part of the question on employment, what is important to keep in mind, and here again, we showed using very careful data, using the periodic labor force survey. While, a lot of commentators have focused on the quantity of employment, what was also important to focus on was the quality of employment. And there, the PLFS data clearly showed that when you compare 2011-12 versus 2017-18, the proportion of salaried workers had actually increased by 5%, and that translated into about 2.6 crore jobs, 1.4 crore in the urban areas and 1.2 crore in the rural areas. So when we talk about employment, and this is something which actually I'm bringing in to talk about the nuance, we need to focus on not just the quantity, but also the quality. So right now, for instance, what we are having is a similar phenomenon where jobs actually, the impact on quantity is not as much as there is on quality. And that's something which is because of the demand side factors.
Right. Well, Dr. Subramanian, thank you for joining us, taking a series of questions at an unprecedented time currently, as you pointed out, both corona, but in terms of economic impact. We hope to have you back when the next series of figures out. And we hope to see a beginning of that V-shaped recovery as well. Thanks so much, Dr. Subramanian.
Thank you very much, Sonia.